You know that feeling when you look out over just like endless desert? It really makes you wonder what secrets could be buried down there. Maybe like a real world Atlantis, but, swallowed by sand instead of sea.
Oh, absolutely. It's a powerful image, isn't it? And it taps right into these ancient legends of lost civilizations.
And that's exactly where we're heading today. We're doing a deep dive into one such story, focusing on a figure named Nabi Hud and his people, the Ad.
Right, the ad. It's a fascinating narrative, particularly within the Islamic tradition, touching on these big themes, prosperity, faith, arrogance, and consequences.
Yeah, and you've pulled together some great material for this. We've got bits from religious texts of the Quran, specifically Surah Hud, but also historical discussions, like in that article, Nabi Hud AS, Tinjawan Religious, Historis, Dan Scientific, and even some connections to, well, potential archaeological finds.
Exactly. The idea is to really unpack the story from all those angles, the religious texts, the historical possibilities, the scientific connections, and try to piece together a fuller picture for everyone listening.
Okay, sounds great. Let's start with the religious perspective then. In Islam, who exactly was Nabi Hud?
Okay, so in Islam, Hud is considered a major prophet, one sent by Allah specifically to the people of Ad.
The Ad people.
Yeah, they were an ancient Arab civilization, supposedly living down in South Arabia. And the tradition says they were seriously blessed, like very wealthy, very powerful.
But there's a catch, I assume.
There usually is, isn't there?
Yep.
Despite all their prosperity, they turned away from worshiping the one God. They fell into idolatry.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay. So it's that classic theme of being given blessings, but then kind of forgetting where they came from.
precisely. And it really highlights a core Islamic principle: accountability. Prosperity doesn't shield you if you reject divine guidance.
Is there a key passage in the Quran that sums up his message?
Oh, definitely. In Surah Hud, that's chapter 11, verse 50, Hud says it plain as day. O my people, worship Allah. You have no deity other than him. You are only fabricators of falsehood.
Wow, pretty direct.
It's a very clear callback to monotheism. No ambiguity there.
And was he, like, asking for anything in return for this message? Personal gain or anything?
Not at all. The Quran actually makes a point of emphasizing his selflessness. In the next couple of verses, 51 and 52, he basically says, look, I don't want any reward from you guys. My reward is with God who made me. He even asks them, don't you get it? Doesn't this make sense?
But the Ad, they didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat, did they?
No, sadly not. The Quran recounts how they flat out rejected him. They even sort of dared him to bring on the punishment he was warning them about.
Really? They challenged him.
Yeah, places like Surah Al-Araf verse 70 and Surah Hud verses 53, 54 detail their defiance. They were pretty arrogant about it.
And that defiance, it didn't end well for them. According to the Quran, we're talking like a major disaster.
A major divine disaster, yes. The Quran describes their destruction very graphically, especially in Surah Al-Haqqa, chapter 69.
Wow.
It talks about this incredibly violent windstorm described as a cold, fierce wind that Allah unleashed on them. And it wasn't just a quick storm. It raged for 7 nights and 8 days straight.
7 nights and 8 days. Wow.
Yeah, and the description is chilling. It says they were left as if they were hollow trunks of palm trees fallen down, just obliterated.
That paints an incredibly stark picture of utter destruction.
It really does. And it drives home that Islamic concept of divine retribution, that earthly power means nothing against God's will if you defy him.
So, total annihilation for the rejectors.
Yeah.
What about Hud himself and anyone who actually listened to him?
Well, the Quran is clear that Hud and his followers, the ones who believed, were saved. They were spared from the catastrophe.
Okay, so there's the moral of the story right there.
Exactly. Faith brings salvation, while rejecting faith, despite all your wealth and power, leads to ruin. Material success is meaningless without that spiritual connection.
Now, besides this main narrative in the Quran, does Islamic tradition offer, like, more details about the Ad? What else do we know?
Oh, yes, definitely. Through things like Tafsir, which is Quranic commentary, and Qisas al-Anbiya, the stories of the prophets, scholars have fleshed out the picture quite a bit.
Like what kind of details?
Well, for instance, the added are often linked to that phrase in Surah Al-Fajr, Iram dahat al-Imara, meaning Iram of the high pillars. It suggests they built this amazing, grand civilization, think impressive architecture.
High pillars. So, advanced builders.
Seems so, but this skill came with a hefty dose of arrogance, and according to tradition, they became quite tyrannical.
So, great builders, but not great people, basically.
That's the picture painted, yeah. Geographically, these traditions place them in a pretty big area of South Arabia, stretching from Hadramaut in Yemen across through Oman, maybe even towards the Persian Gulf Coast.
Okay. And what about the people themselves? Any descriptions?
They're often described as being unusually tall and strong. And skilled engineers, too, they supposedly develop sophisticated irrigation systems to make the desert bloom, specifically in that area called Al-Akaf, the curved sand dunes mentioned in the Quran.
Al-Akaf.
Right. And interestingly, the Quran consistently calls Hud their brother, which really emphasizes, he wasn't an outsider. He was one of them, understood their culture, spoke their language.
Which makes their rejection even more tragic,
Oh,
really.
exactly.
You also mentioned before a link to another ancient group, the Thamud. How do they fit in?
Yes, that connection's important. The Thamud are the people associated with the prophet Saleh, who came later. Some traditions actually suggest that the Thamud were, in a way, descended from the survivors of Ad, or at least they became known as the second Ad.
The second Ad, so like history repeating itself.
Well, the parallels are certainly drawn. Both peoples were seen as arrogant, both rejected their prophets, and both faced similar kinds of divine punishment. It's presented as a recurring lesson.
Is that link mentioned in the Quran too?
It is, implicitly. In Surah Al-Araf, verse 74, God reminds the Thamud, saying something like, "Remember when he made you successors after Ad and settled you in the land," and then mentions their own impressive building skills, carving homes from mountains?
So it's like saying, hey, remember what happened to the guys before you. Don't make the same mistake.
Precisely. It's a direct warning, using the fate of the Ad as a cautionary tale for the Thamud.
It's really fascinating how these narratives are woven together. Okay, let's switch gears a bit. That's the Islamic perspective. What about Judaism and Christianity? Do we find Hud or the Ad in their scriptures?
And this is where it gets really interesting because no, there's no prophet named Hud and no people called Ad mentioned directly in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, or in the Christian Old Testament.
Really? Completely absent.
As distinct figures named Hud and Ad, yes. However, there is a figure in Genesis that some Islamic scholars have historically linked to Hud. A man named Eber.
Eber. The name rings a bell. Tell me about him in the Jewish tradition.
Okay, so in Genesis, Eber, that's Unshet in Hebrew, is a descendant of Noah through Noah's son Shem. The line goes Shem, Arpachshad, Shelah, and then Eber. Eber is significant because he's considered an ancestor of many peoples, and tradition holds he's the namesake for the Hebrews. He's also listed as the father of two sons, Peleg and Joktan. Genesis 10.25 mentions this specifically. Yulever yulad shenivanem, Shem hachat Peleg, Veshem ashiv Yoktan. And to Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, and the name of his brother was Joktan. And that name, Joktan, is often identified in Arab tradition with Qatan, who's seen as the ancestor of the southern Arabs.
Ah, okay, so that's the potential link to Hud through Eber and his descendants in Arabia.
Exactly. Some classical Muslim scholars, like Ibn Kathir, for example, actually identified Hud with Eber, or at least placed him in that same lineage, Hud son of Shelah, making him Eber's contemporary, or possibly the same person. The name Hud bin Salih is sometimes interpreted as potentially equivalent to Eber bin Shelah.
Huh. Interesting connection.
It is, and it finds some resonance in local traditions in Yemen, too. But, and this is crucial, this identification isn't found in Jewish scripture itself. In Judaism, Eber is an important ancestor in the Table of Nations after the flood, but he's not considered a prophet who preached to his people like Hud did. There are no stories of his prophethood in Genesis.
Got it. So, ancestor, yes. Prophet, no. In Christianity, does it follow the Jewish understanding?
Pretty much, yes. Since the Christian Old Testament is based on the Hebrew Bible, Eber is recognized as an ancestor. He even appears in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. But again, just as an ancestor, not as a prophet in the Islamic sense.
So, bottom line, no direct equivalent for Nabi Hud or the Ad in Judeo-Christian texts. The whole story of the windstorm destruction, that's unique to the Islamic narrative.
Correct. While you have stories of divine punishment for wickedness like Sodom and Gomorrah, the specific narrative of Hud, the Ad, Iram, the windstorm, that's distinctly Islamic and rooted in Arabian tradition.
It's pretty striking, isn't it? Such a central figure in one tradition just isn't there in the others. You mentioned some scholars suggest these stories came from pre-Islamic Arabia itself.
Yes, that's a common view among Western scholars, especially historically. The idea being that stories about Ad and Thamud were already circulating in Arabia before Islam emerged as part of their own oral
And there's
traditions.
evidence for that.
Well, there's a telling quote from the early Muslim historian al-Tabari. He mentions that when some Jews in Medina questioned Hud's prophethood because he wasn't in the Torah, the response was basically that Ad, Thamud, Hud, and Salih were as well known and foundational to the Arabs as Abraham was to the Israelites.
Wow. So deeply ingrained in their own cultural memory.
Exactly. It suggests these narratives had a life of their own in Arabia before being incorporated and given their specific theological weight within Islam.
That makes a lot of sense. A regional tradition preserved and elevated. Okay, so if we look beyond the main Abrahamic faiths, did these stories or figures like Hud pop up anywhere else?
Well, certainly within pre-Islamic Arabia itself, even if the name Hud isn't everywhere, the idea of powerful, arrogant tribes being wiped out in the desert was definitely a known trope. You find references in old Arab poetry to the destruction of Ad and Thamud, used as examples, of how fleeting power can be.
Like cautionary tales.
Exactly. There was a poet, Umayyah bin Abi Salt, who lived just before Prophet Muhammad's time, and his poetry mentions Thamud and Salih's she-camel. So the key elements of these stories were definitely circulating.
So Islam didn't invent these stories whole cloth.
No, it seems they were building on existing narratives familiar to the people of Arabia. And significantly, down in Hadramaut in Yemen, there's the traditional tomb of Nabi Hud Kabr Hud.
Right, you mentioned that.
And historical sources tell us that people were making annual pilgrimages there before Islam, which strongly suggests a very old, localized veneration of a figure named Hud in that specific region.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Pre-Islamic pilgrimage to his tomb.
Yeah. Now, looking further afield, the Baha'i faith does recognize Hud as a prophet in their scriptures, like the Kitabi-i-Khan, but they largely draw their understanding from the Islamic accounts.
Okay.
Any other groups? Not really in a clear way. Traditions like Mandeanism or other older Middle Eastern beliefs don't seem to have a direct parallel figure. So really, Hud seems primarily rooted in Arabian tradition, which was then formalized and given central importance in the Quran.
Okay. That gives us a good handle on the religious landscape.
Yeah.
The summary table really helps visualize those differences. Let's shift now to the historical angle. How do we even try to place Ad and Hud in actual verifiable history?
Yeah, and this is where, honestly, it gets much tougher. Unlike some other figures, finding clear non-Islamic historical records that mention Hud or the Ad by name is, well, it's extremely difficult. Our main historical framework comes largely from within the Arab Islamic tradition itself.
So we have to be careful about separating tradition from, say, archaeological fact.
Absolutely. Let's start with trying to figure out when they might have lived. Traditional Arab genealogies, the ones recorded by early Muslim historians, trace Ad back to Noah. Specifically, Ad, son of Asis, son of Iram, son of Shem, son of Noah.
Okay, so that puts them really early, like 4th generation after Noah.
According to that lineage, yes. If you try to map that onto a biblical timeline, you're looking somewhere in the 3rd millennium BC, maybe after the flood narrative, but definitely before Abraham, who's usually placed around 2000 BC. The Quran also often presents Hud and Salah after Noah, which can give that impression of chronological order.
But you said modern scholars have a different take.
Well, some, like Hamblin, argue the Quran's order might be more about themes than strict chronology, and they point out that medieval Muslim historians were definitely trying to fit these figures into the existing biblical timeline.
Okay. So the exact date is pretty speculative.
Very speculative. What's perhaps more solid is how Arab tradition itself classifies them as al-Arab al-Baida, the lost or extinct Arabs. People who lived so long ago, they predate what we think of as recorded Arab history, certainly before the big South Arabian kingdoms like Saba or Himyar came along later, around the 1st millennium BC.
So even to later Arabs, they were ancient history.
Exactly. Now, where did they live? The Quran points to Al-Akaf, the curved sand dunes, usually linked to Hadramaut in Yemen or the big empty quarter desert.
The Rub al-Khali.
Right. Some commentators, like Yusuf Ali, suggested their territory was vast, maybe stretching from Oman across to Yemen. This hints that maybe Abda wasn't just one city, but perhaps a confederation of tribes across a wide area.
Okay. Does that geography connect to any non-Quranic ancient sources?
Potentially. There's the 2nd century AD geographer Ptolemy. In his map of Arabia, he mentions a people or region called the Iobarite in the south.
Iobarite.
Yeah. And archaeologist Juris Zerns proposed a theory linking these Iobarite, maybe pronounced Ubarite, to a tribe or group called Ubar. And that name, Ubar, gets linked to the legend of Iram.
Iram, city of pillars, the Atlantis of the sands.
That's the one. So Zarin's idea is that maybe Ubar is the historical reality or the classical name behind the legend of Ad and their city, Iram.
That's a pretty exciting connection.
It is, but again, the crucial caveat, the actual name Ad, the people of Ad, hasn't shown up in, say, Egyptian or Mesopotamian records that we have so far.
Unlike the Thamud.
Exactly, unlike the Thamud. We do have external records mentioning the Thamud Assyrian inscriptions from the 8th century BC, even Roman army lists mentioning Thamud cavalry units much later. That confirms Thamud were a known historical group. The absence of similar records for Ad could mean they were much earlier and simply faded before those records were kept, or perhaps known by a different name we haven't connected yet, like Ubar.
Makes sense. So the lack of direct mentions makes it tough. Were there other attempts to link Ad to known groups?
There were some older 19th century ideas trying to connect Ad to groups like the Ayad or Oeditai, or even the biblical city of Adma. But those links were pretty thin, based mostly on sound similarity, and didn't really hold up geographically or chronologically. Most scholars today don't put much stock in them.
So the consensus is still looking.
Pretty much. The direct historical ID is unconfirmed. But many researchers think the Ad likely fit into the context of early Scytho Arabian cultures in the 3rd or 2nd millennium BC, which is when we see things like the incense trade starting up and oasis settlements developing.
Okay, so if we can't find Ad written down everywhere, let's chase that Iram lead.
Yeah.
The city of pillars. You mentioned the discovery at Shisr in Oman.
Yes, this is probably the most compelling archaeological link, even if it's still debated. The Quran's description of Iram al-Amin fueled this Atlantis of the Sands legend for centuries.
A lost city swallowed by the desert.
Exactly. Then in the 1990s, this expedition led by Nicholas Clapp and Juris Zarins used NASA technology, specifically satellite radar that could penetrate sand to trace ancient caravan trails.
Wow. Space archaeology.
Kinda, yeah. And these ancient tracks all converged on this one spot, the oasis of Shisr in Oman. When they excavated, they found the foundations of a fortress, an unusual one, 8-sided, with towers at the corners.
8 sides, like pillars.
No towers, but definitely a substantial structure. And crucially, right in the middle, a massive sinkhole. They also found pottery linking the site to trade networks around the 1st to 3rd centuries AD.
Okay, so a real trading post that collapsed into a sinkhole and got buried. That sounds familiar.
It really does align with the core elements of the Iram legend, doesn't it? The theory is the fortress collapsed because the underground water source, the well that sustained the oasis, dried up or the ground above it gave way.
So was Shisr definitively Iram?
Well, Zarins himself actually leans towards Ubar or Iram being the name of the region or the people, the Ubarite Obarite, not just one city. Shisr would have been a major outpost within that Ubar region, maybe the main hub.
Ah, okay. So not the city, but a city of Ubarim.
Possibly. But the features match the legend remarkably well. A fortified place with prominent towers, pillars, linked to the wealth of the caravan trade, like the Ad's prosperity, and its sudden disappearance due to water source failure and being buried by sand.
And the timing. When was this place active?
NASA's analysis and the archaeology suggest it was occupied over a long period, maybe from as early as 2800 BC up to around 300 AD, serving as a key point in the frankincense trade. Then the collapse happened. It's possible the legend of Iram blends memories from different periods of occupation at this important site.
That makes sense. Legends often compress history. Did the stories about Iram get exaggerated over time?
Oh, absolutely. Later classical Arab accounts describe Iram in ridiculously fantastical terms. Pillars of solid gold, hundreds of thousands of palaces, magical gardens. Pure hyperbole. But beneath the fantasy, the discovery at Shisr gives us a tangible kernel of truth, a significant fortified oasis settlement that prospered and then collapsed dramatically.
So Shisr provides a plausible historical anchor for the Iram legend, even if we can't definitively label it City of the Odd.
Precisely. It's the best physical evidence we have that aligns with that part of the narrative. And then, of course, you still have the traditional sites like the Tomb of Nabi Hud in Yemen.
Right, the pilgrimage site.
Yeah, mentioned by historians way back in the 12th century, and evidence suggests pre-Islamic veneration there. Again, can't prove it's his tomb archaeologically, but it shows how strong and persistent the memory of Hud was in that region.
Oh, okay. And circling back to the Thamud connection, how does that look historically?
Well, as we said, the Thamud are much more historically attested. We find their name, we know roughly where they lived in North Arabia, we see their inscriptions. Mada in Sela, the famous site with the rock tombs, is associated with them, even though the grand tombs themselves are Nabatean.
But the Thamud were there before or around that time.
Likely inhabited the area earlier, yes. And Islamic tradition firmly links that site, Al-Hijr, to the Thamud of Prophet Saleh. There's even the story of Prophet Muhammad passing by during the Tabuk expedition and telling his followers not to linger because it was a place where people were punished. So the memory of it being a cursed place associated with Thamud was alive then.
So the link between Ad and Thamud, it feels like a continuity.
It does seem like a geographical and cultural continuity within ancient Arabia. Both are called Arab al-Baida, the extinct Arabs. They're linked genealogically in some accounts, mentioned together in poetry, paired in the Quran. Maybe the Thamud inherited traditions or even populations from the earlier southern groups associated with Ad as prominence shifted northward over time.
And what about links to, say, Atlantis? Any truth to that?
Nah, that's pretty much dismissed today. Just superficial similarities of a lost advanced civilization, no real historical or geographical connection.
Okay, so summing up the historical view. Ada were likely a real ancient South Arabian people, maybe 3rd, 2nd millennium BC, associated with the rise of oasis settlements and trade. Their decline or destruction, possibly linked to events reflected in the Iro Ubar legend and the site of Shisur, became a powerful memory, passed down orally and eventually recorded in the Quran, often linked to the later, more historically visible Thamud. But direct, unambiguous proof. Still elusive.
That's a very good summary. It's about piecing together tradition, geography, archaeology, and comparative history while acknowledging the gaps.
Right, which leads us perfectly into the scientific perspective. If history is tricky, can modern science add more pieces to this puzzle?
I think it really can, and in some fascinating ways. That discovery of Ubar Shizr we keep coming back to, that's a prime example. Using space-based radar to find a city buried under sand, that's science uncovering history that supports the setting of a Quranic legend.
So science confirms a city matching the description existed and disappeared.
Exactly. Archaeology confirms the existence of the settlement, the towers, the oasis setting. And geology can even offer plausible natural explanations for its demise, like that sinkhole collapse due to changes in the groundwater.
But the Quran talks about destruction by wind. How does science square that with a sinkhole?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be either. Think about the environment. We're talking about a desert region prone to massive sandstorms. It's entirely plausible that severe, prolonged windstorms, the kind the Quran describes, could have dramatically destabilized the ground, maybe eroded the area around the underground cavern supporting the fortress, accelerating a collapse that was already waiting to happen.
So the wind could have been the trigger, or at least a major contributing factor.
Precisely. Or the most dramatic, visible part of the event that people remembered and focused on in the oral tradition. The ground collapsing might have been part of the same disastrous period. Desert geology, especially with karst formations, soluble rock with underground caves and water systems, is known for this kind of sudden subsidence. So the Quran's focus on wind as the destructive force could absolutely encompass the environmental chain reaction, including the ground giving way.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. A combination of factors, with the wind being the most memorable agent. What other scientific angles are there? Inscriptions, climate.
Yeah, there are a few threads. Some scholars point to disputed readings of ancient South Arabian inscriptions that might possibly mention Hud, suggesting pre-Islamic awareness. It's debated, but intriguing. Also, that possible link between the Quranic Iram and the Egyptian mention of Iram in Papyrus Anastasia V from the 13th century BC, that's an interesting linguistic connection, maybe placing a similar name in the right general area anciently.
Okay, and the climate data you mentioned earlier.
Right, climatology is huge here. Studies show South Arabia wasn't always hyper-arid. Back around the 3rd millennium BC, it was significantly wetter, more like a savanna in places. That's the kind of environment that could have supported a flourishing civilization, like the Adder described.
So they lived during a greener period.
Potentially, yes. But then you have that major climate shift, the 4.2 kiloyear event around 2200 BC. This caused widespread severe drought across the Near East. And geoarchaeology in Oman confirms that settlements were being abandoned around this time, specifically because water sources were drying up.
Wow, that timing fits remarkably well with the potential time frame for Ad.
It really does. So that Quranic description of a devastating wind lasting days, maybe it's a metaphorical memory of a much longer ecological catastrophe, like years of drought, shifting monsoons, relentless sandstorms caused by that climate change event, ultimately leading to the collapse of their water-dependent society. Science provides a plausible backdrop for a sudden, devastating environmental shift.
That's incredible. Connecting scripture to actual paleoclimate data. What about genetics? Can that tell us anything?
Well, it's more indirect, obviously, but genetics shows that modern Arab populations tend to fall into two broad clusters, North Adnani and South Qahtani. And remember, tradition links the southern Qahtani Arabs back to Iberhud.
Right.
DNA studies in Yemen and Oman show some very ancient genetic lineages are present there, possibly reflecting these deep-rooted populations. Now, we can't find Hud's DNA, of course, but maybe migration patterns could offer clues. Some studies suggest genetic movement out of Arabia northward around the 2nd millennium BC. Could that represent survivors, maybe ancestors of the Thamud, moving after an ecological collapse in the south? It's highly speculative, but ancient DNA from sites like Shishir, if ever found, could be revolutionary.
It's amazing how many different scientific fields can potentially shed light on this. What about comparing this story to other myths?
Anthropologically, yeah, it's interesting. Stories of floods, fires, divine wrath wiping out arrogant civilizations are common across cultures, Atlantis, Borca in India, etc. It seems to be a way societies process and remember catastrophes, often framing them in moral terms.
The ad story has that specific Arabian flavor.
Exactly. The destruction by wind and sand is uniquely suited to the Arabian desert environment. It suggests a core memory of a real, local type of disaster, which then got woven into this larger moral and religious narrative. Science can help separate the potential event oasis collapse, drought, storms from the interpretation of why it happened.
Seeing the event and the narrative as different layers.
Yeah.
And social sciences, how do they help reconstruct what ad society might have been like?
Social archaeology tries to do that by comparing them to what we know about other ancient oasis societies. Probably semi-nomadic elements mixed with settled life, relying on irrigation, building with stone and mud brick. The Quranic lines about building castles on plains might refer to prominent structures in oasis areas, while carving houses in mountains could hint at a practice later associated more strongly with the Thamud. Looking at related sites like older levels at Shabwa or megalithic structures in the region helps build a comparative picture. Even studying modern Bedouin life can offer some analogies for desert survival strategies.
So taking all this science together, it doesn't disprove the story of Nabihud.
Not at all. If anything, it adds layers of plausibility. It shows that the setting is real advanced oasis cultures existed and collapsed in that region. It shows that the mechanisms of destruction described, wind, environmental collapse, are scientifically feasible for that time and place. It confirms a strong oral tradition existed. While science can't prove the divine intervention aspect, it provides a robust historical and environmental context into which the traditional narrative fits surprisingly well.
It grounds the story in a potentially real-world scenario.
Exactly. It bridges the gap between scripture and empirical evidence, suggesting the story preserves the memory of real events, interpreted through a religious lens. And, research continues. Maybe more evidence will turn up.
This has been incredibly thorough. Okay, let's try to pull the main threads together one last time. Religiously,
Hud is a key prophet in Islam, bringing that core message of monotheism. The story of the ad is a powerful foundational lesson about faith versus arrogance, prosperity versus piety, and divine justice. And it's notable how this central figure in Islam doesn't appear, prophetically speaking, in Judaism or Christianity, despite that potential ancestral link through Eber.
Okay, and historically?
Historically, it's complex. The ad are elusive and direct records, but likely represent an ancient South Arabian people from the 3rd or 2nd millennium BC. The legend of Iram and the discovery of Ubarshir offer a tantalizing, though not definitive, link to a real collapsed oasis civilization. And the connection to the later, historically verified Thamud suggests a continuity of peoples and traditions within Arabia. It's a blend of memory and potential history.
Right. And finally, the scientific angle.
Science provides remarkable context and corroboration. Archaeology confirms the type of settlement described could exist and collapse as remembered. Geology and climatology offer plausible natural mechanisms, sinkholes, drought, storms aligning with the time frame and the Quranic description of destruction. Genetics hints at ancient population structures. Science makes the story historically and environmentally plausible.
So, bringing it all together, the story of Nabihud and the ad, viewed through all these lenses, really resonates as more than just an ancient tale, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It functions as this timeless warning, really, a reminder about the dangers of collective pride, the potential fragility of even advanced societies, and how quickly prosperity can vanish when faced with overwhelming forces, whether you see those forces as purely natural or, through faith, as instruments of divine will.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How many of our ancient stories, our myths, our religious narratives might hold these echoes of real events, real people, real environmental shifts from the distant past, and how looking at them through different disciplinary eyes, history, religion, science, can reveal complementary, sometimes overlapping, sometimes conflicting, but always fascinating layers of meaning. What other stories are out there, just waiting for us to connect the dots in new ways?
That's the big question, isn't it? The past still holds so many secrets.
It certainly does. Well, thank you for taking us on this fascinating deep dive today.
My pleasure. It's a compelling story from every angle.
And thanks everyone for listening.